Be hearing from Katie Welch. Katie is a PhD student at Oklahoma State University, and she's working on topics including rural development and rural economies.
Perfect, thank you. What we're looking at from my presentation are the economic impacts of drought and the effects of disaster relief insurance on Oklahoma's rural communities. So this is going to be more of like an in-depth case study on what's happened in a couple counties as opposed to the entire state. But the concepts are transferable. So I've been working on this with a few people at Oklahoma State that are listed there. So the problem, what we're looking at is what are the economic losses experienced by communities in Tillman, Jackson, and Harmon counties due to drought. And so the first thing we think about drought impacts are probably those crop and livestock sectors, but we know that it trickles to more sectors of the economy than just the crop and livestock ones. So what factors make the producers more resilient to drought? So how are they able to mitigate the effects of drought with their risk management strategies? And specifically, what kind of effects do those disaster relief insurance programs offer? So there are a lot of things saying, hey, you should enroll in these, they're really beneficial, but how much do they actually help? So you'll recognize this from the last presentation. This is the drought monitor, and like Gary said, the darker colors represent more severe drought. So we have that period from 2006 to 2007. The 2011 to mid 2015 was a pretty bad period. We also have that 2018 period and the 2022 starting one. So the methodology in this study is going to cover all the years from 2000 to 2021 because that's what we have data for. But a lot of times we're going to break it out and just look at that 2011 to 2014 drought to kind of make examples of things. So again, the darker colors indicate more severe drought. You can see in 2011, nearly over half the state was in that D4 exceptional drought. In 2022, whenever I snipped this picture, it was mostly the western part of the state, and the area we're going to be looking is going to be this little southwest corner down here. So we'll show the study region in just a minute. So like I said, we're looking at the effects of drought, and we expect some economic loss in both our crop and our livestock sectors. But we also expect to see some trickle-down effects to other sectors. And besides this, you also have effects including water restrictions, brush fires, the loss of recreation due to low lake levels and low water levels. So those are just some other things to consider when we're thinking about drought. And the way we really want to think about this is we're going to use input-output analysis to estimate how this works, but it's based on export-based theory. And so that just says that some region produces a good or service. So in this instance, maybe it's wheat. And then that good is demanded outside of the region. And then that demand generates income as people purchase this wheat. And so IO extends this theory to sales, where those sales bring the income into the region. And then as that income is respent, you generate this multiplier effect as it gets respent multiple times throughout the local economy. And then that effect size is just determined by how many rounds of local purchasing it goes through. So a way to think about this visually is if we start with this center box that says direct effects, we have crop producers who experience change in their yields and change in their harvested acres. And then we have our livestock producers who have changes in their herd size and their herd composition as they sell off livestock or have to cull some of their cattle. And so if you go left on that figure to the backward linkages, you can think about these as supporting sectors. So these are people that our crop producers and our livestock producers are buying inputs from. So this could be seed, it could be fertilizer, it could be feed for their cattle. And so as they experience this drought, and I'm pretty sure that none of the farmers who realize that, you know, their crop is going to fail, they're not going to throw extra fertilizer out on it, right? So that's a decrease in an input that they've purchased. And so that changes the dollar amount of purchased inputs. And as these dollar amounts add up, that results in a change in the amount of labor employed in those input industries. And that is where we get our induced effects, where you have a change in your household spending because these people no longer work as many hours at their jobs as they would have normally if this event hadn't occurred. So that's our input sectors. That's one portion of the effects we're going to see. But then we can also go to the forward linkages on the right side of that middle box and think about the change in output sold. So if we're talking about wheat, this is like they don't have as much wheat to sell to millers. So the millers experience losses because they no longer have that wheat to purchase and they can't sell it to other intermediate processors or final markets. And so the point of input-output analysis is we're able to collect all of these effects and sum up and see the whole economy effects. So another thing, my arrows were supposed to come at different times, so that's another thing we're gonna have to live with. But so multi-regional input-output effect models, they capture the effects in linked regions. So in a regular model, you'll be able to see what happens in your region, but anything that leaves it is gone. When you have multiple regions, you can trace those effects into your neighboring regions and see what happens before, you just get to see more of those impacts. And of course, anything that leaves the region is a leakage and you can't follow that anymore. So the way that looks in Oklahoma, and in this study, so our main impact region is that dark red 3-county region of Jackson, Harmon, and Tillman counties down the southwest corner. So our impacts are going to start there. They're going to flow into the Kiowa and Greer County region and into the rest of Oklahoma, which is our 3rd region. Anything in a blue arrow is lost outside of the region and we can't track that money anymore. So what we're essentially seeing here is that we can follow those effects into Kiowa and Greer, we can follow it into the rest of Oklahoma, and then we can also see the feedback as they move through those regions between each other. And so we really just capture a lot more of the impacts that way. Data from this project mostly came from the USDA, National Agricultural Statistics Service, looking at crop yields, harvest, things like that. We also got some data from the Risk Management Agency, and that was on our insurance indemnity payments, and the Bureau of Economic Analysis. MPlan is the software that we're using, and it also has our underlying economy data layer. And like I said earlier, we're looking at all the years from 2000 to 2021 because we want a longitudinal view of how drought has looked in the economy as a whole over this time span. We're going to talk about a couple different kinds of effects, and I just want to go over those real fast so that people unfamiliar with the terms know what we're talking about. So the first type of effect is going to be output, and that's basically your sales, receipts, operating income. You can think of it as revenue. So this is the amount of money you're generating before you take those costs and things out. The second type of effect is going to be employment. This is the total number of jobs, and that includes full-time, part-time, and seasonal employment. And then value added is the last one. It's a little tricky to think about, but it's basically your industry's contribution to GDP. And some people like to compare it to profit. So if output is our revenue, value added is really our profit. The last thing I wanted to say here is that these effects all occur within a 1-year time span. So for the most part, we'll be talking about individual years. And if we extrapolate from that, I will say. So this is the contribution of agricultural sectors within Jackson, Harmon, and Tillman counties. This means this slide is basically telling us what the existing activity of the agricultural sectors contribute to Oklahoma's economy. And then you can think about if these sectors did not exist, what would happen? And so from our calculations, we found that agriculture contributes 2,800 jobs, $518 million in output, and $175 million in value added. And that's just in those that 3-county region. And then the next thing I wanted you to notice here is down at the bottom of the slide, some of my labels have disappeared, but those 4 main columns that are orange are all direct impact industries, meaning it's like cotton, grain farming like wheat, and those agricultural sectors. But that fourth one you're going to see is the fourth largest one impacted, and it's all yellow and green. It's all indirect and induced effects, and that's the financial, insurance, and real estate industry. And that's just showing that even though it's not one of the agricultural industries, it is one of the top impacted industries because of how closely related it is to those agricultural sectors. So they buy a lot of services from that sector, and you can see that. So that means that when they experience these drought impacts, the financial, insurance, and real estate industries are also going to experience them very heavily. But this is just talking about how the impact calculations are done. And what we're basically doing is we are estimating what the average revenue would be in a year. And then we're taking the actual revenue that these producers received and subtracting that potential revenue from it. And the difference in those is going to be our drought loss. So if they could normally harvest this many, acres, getting this much yield at this price, but in the drought that's reduced, we're going to see that negative shock. And then to incorporate the effects of insurance, we're just going to add that insurance indemnity payment back into the calculation. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about on this one was we have to think about livestock. And livestock is not like crop production, because crop production generally occurs in year cycles, right? You plant, you harvest, and then you're ready for next year. Livestock, especially cattle, you almost have to treat more like an asset, because you keep some of these, especially in Oklahoma, you keep cattle as breeding stock from year to year. And when you're in drought, your producers aren't automatically going to sell off cattle. When we went and spoke to them in the region, they're more likely to hold on to their cattle. They want to protect the genetic integrity of their herd, and they'll wait to sell any off, because that's just something they want. And so we have to think about, how does that look in drought? And so our solution was to look at the change in inventory, change in the value of the inventory, because as cattle prices change and as the composition of the herd changes, that value changes, and that's going to reflect our livestock impacts. So here, these are just those calculations we've done. What are these agricultural industries losing directly? So in that red column, what I wanted to point out is that the impacts in 2011 are relatively higher than our other years, and we're going to notice that that trend holds after we put it through the model. In 2012, you're going to see that positive number for wheat, so $27.4 million. And you may think, okay, why do we have a positive number for wheat in a drought year? And that's because there was actually a bumper wheat crop in that year. And then you'll also see those positive numbers for cattle, for livestock, down in 2013 and 2014. And again, it's because cattle prices were so high. There was a major cattle cull following 2011, 2012, and that lowered supply pushed the prices of these cattle up. So that's why we see those positive values when everything else is negative. And so just thinking about this visually, what we're doing is we're imposing those negative shocks to those agricultural industries, and then they're shocking the rest of the economy, where we get those changes in jobs, output, and value added. And so our results, and again, this is just our 2011 to 2014 years. I didn't want to present you with a 20-year table. That would be a lot to look at numerically. So in 2011, again, we do see they have relatively higher impacts, with $332 million in output lost, 2,200 jobs lost, and $141 million in value added. If you average across all those drought years, that one drought period had an average of $166 million in output lost per year, 1,110 jobs lost, and $69 million in value added lost. And again, that averages per year, so for each year of the drought occurring. So one thing we wanted to talk about was, we have that disaster relief insurance, and after we add this effect in, how does it change? And so if you'll just skip straight to the bottom of the table, we have those totals. So the total impact from 2011 to 2014 was $662 million in value added. But after we included those disaster relief insurance indemnity payments from the risk management agency, that dropped our output loss from 662 million to 309 million. And so it was reduced by 53%, which is phenomenal. And then we can see in employment, we also had a 50% drop, and then in value added, it was a 45% drop. So these disaster relief payments make a big difference to these producers and to the people in the economy that they're linked with, or the sectors of the economy that are linked to them. Another thing, sorry, my boxes have moved again. So this is just the industries that are affected, and it's going to be our top 5 and bottom 5, which are our quartiles. And so in 2014, you'll start in that first, right where lower quartile says, you'll see that grain farming had an impact of nearly $28 million lost. But then after you add those insurance payments in, grain farming actually goes to the very opposite end of the spectrum. It's at the very top of our upper quartile with a gain of $12.5 million in output. And that's because with those payments coming in, they could still afford to perhaps purchase inputs for next year, still make payments on anything they had to in their production activities, just whatever they were spending money on before, they were still able to do that as a result of those payments. This is a quick look at the output with the output loss over time. So this is from 2000 to 2021. So you'll see that there's a 0 right at a little over halfway up that axis, the y-axis. That 0 would be representative of a perfectly average year. And so we don't really hit that often, right? And we wouldn't expect to. And so what we see is in these non-drought periods, we have this above 0. So they have better than average years. So they have positive output. And then whenever it drops below that 0, those are our drought periods. And so you can see that, if my labels were there, that 2011 to 2014 drought period was pretty severe, but the difference between the blue and the orange line is actually the difference between our output and then what our output is with the indemnities. So you see that those indemnities, they moderate those drought periods. In non-drought years, they're pretty much overlaid on each other because you wouldn't expect those payouts in years where you don't have drought. But in those years where you see that blue line really take a dive, you see that orange line pulls it back up. So those indemnities really do counteract some of the effects. You can see again that those peaks would have occurred right where those most affected years were. This is the last one I wanted to show you, and this is just looking at those drought impacts with the soil water. So the blue line again is our output, the loss, and then that gray line is our soil water. And conveniently, they have nearly the same units. They're both in negative millions, but one's in dollars and one's in cubic meters, so we have them on the same line. And you can see that there is quite a bit of correlation between those, the soil water and the effects on output. So in conclusion, what we really see is that there are large losses in drought periods. For instance, in the 2011 to 2014 period, we saw an average loss of $166 million in output, 1,100 jobs, and $69 million in value added. But there are mitigating effects. So diversification really is a great risk management strategy for producers who had wheat in 2012. They didn't suffer the same impacts as people who were perhaps only farming cotton or only had livestock. The same thing in 2013 and 2014 with those record high cattle prices. Those really helped to mitigate effects as compared to like the 2011 year where everything had high negative impacts. And then another really important thing is those insurance indemnity payments. And you can see that noticeable effect in drought periods versus those non-drought or those less severe drought periods, how they really curb that effect that the drought has. And this is just my contact info, and then Dr. Dayton Lambert is actually the lead on this research project. So you can email either of us with any questions you have that you don't get answered in the webinar. I'm sorry for all the format issues. I didn't realize were going to happen when I moved it over to this webinar, but I really appreciate you all taking the time to listen.